They vanished without a sound. A knock at night, a name erased, a body never found. In the shadow of Argentina's flowering jacarandas, fear took root. Mothers clutched photographs. Neighbors looked away. And the voices that might have cried out, in pulpits, in pews, in print, stayed silent. This is a story of the disappeared, of whispered prayers and unmarked graves, of what happens when the church turns away, and of a theology that dared to speak before it was buried. Welcome to Gateway Books by Crestance, the podcast where historical fiction opens the door to real history. I'm your host, Cindy Cruz. In today's episode, we walk into the flowering stillness of the Jacarandas by Mark Whittle, a novel set during Argentina's dirty war, when tens of thousands of people were disappeared by a military regime that ruled through fear, secrecy, and control. It's a story rooted in absence, in the spaces left behind by those who vanished, and in the moral silences that helped make it possible. We'll follow that thread into two nonfiction works. First, the foundational voice of the liberation theology, Gustavo Gutiérrez's A Theology of Liberation, a book that reimagined faith not as charity, but as solidarity with the poor. Then, we turn to The Catholic Church and Argentina's Dirty War by Gustavo Morello, a stark, unflinching look at what happens when faith and power become too closely aligned. This isn't just about religion. It's about complicity, about what's lost when the institutions that shape our values choose protection over conscience. Let's begin. It begins with Daniel's certainty. He is young, idealistic, and unwavering in his belief that Argentina is slipping into chaos. When his uncle, a federal police officer, is killed in an uncertain attack, it confirms what Daniel already suspects, that the nation must be defended from within. He joins the federal police, not reluctantly, but with resolve. He sees himself as part of something righteous, a stabilizing force in a country tearing itself apart. His early assignments are simple. Observe his classmates at university. Listen, report, keep the country safe. He believes it matters, that subversion starts with meetings, books, and whispers. Then Eva arrives. She's brilliant, fearless, deeply rooted in the resistance. Her parents were taken by the regime when she was a child. Her brother, a priest, preaches the liberation theology, a gospel of solidarity with the poor, grounded in justice and resistance. Daniel is drawn to her. He begins to empathize, to feel the contradictions pressing in. But he keeps filing his reports. He never names her. He even tries to steer attention away. But the information he's already provided, cross-referenced with reports from others, is enough. One afternoon, on his way home, he passes the Plaza de Mayo. He sees the mothers walking in circles, white scarves on their heads, photos of their children in their hands. He watches them and feels nothing. Their grief is still someone else's history. Then everything fractures. Eva disappears. Her brother, Daniel's best friend, gone, without warning, without trial, without return. He begins to understand not just what has happened, but what he's done. The reports, the hesitation, the failure to act. The regime that once held him close no longer needs him. He's discarded, imprisoned, left behind by the machine he once served. When he is released, he does not try to reclaim his former life. Instead, he becomes a prison chaplain, under the quiet mentorship of a priest who once stood beside Eva's brother and survived abduction and torture because of it. Daniel chooses to remain in that space. He does not ask to be absolved, but he does not look away. Eventually, he returns to the plaza. The mothers are still there, still marching, still holding the names of the disappeared. And this time, Daniel sees them fully. Their grief is no longer distant. The Jacarandas is not a story about redemption. It's a story of reckoning, slowly, unbearable, incomplete. It asks what happens when belief curdles into betrayal, and how a person goes on living after they've seen the full cost of their actions. The church appears throughout the story, not in proclamations, but in absence. The priests who aligned themselves with the poor vanished. Nuns disappeared. So did the mothers who marched, and the silence from the institution was taken as acquiescence. The altars stayed intact. The sacraments continued. The radical priests were offered like sacrificial lambs, not for faith, but for the continuity of power. Years later, one of the architects of the terror is found living in Spain. He is extradited to stand trial, but the deeper fracture happens elsewhere, when his daughter learns the truth. She was likely stolen from the arms of the disappeared, raised by the man who helped erase her history. And now she chooses absence of her own. She walks away. The jacaranda tree blooms throughout the novel. Their petals fall over sidewalks and city squares, soft, steady, unchanging. They do not mourn, but they remain. The Jacarandas is a novel about complicity and the long, unrelenting shadow it casts. It asks what it means to follow orders, to do nothing, to look away. And it refuses to let that question fade. This isn't a story of one man's guilt. It's a story of the systems that survive by consuming people like him, and of those who are consumed without ever being named. What happens when theology begins not with authority, but with the poor? In 1971, a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutiérrez published a book that would shake the foundation of the Catholic Church throughout the Americas, A Theology of Liberation. It was not a manifesto. It didn't call for revolt. It was instead a work of deep theology, systematic, spiritual, and rigorous. But its central premise was unsettling to the established order, that the Church's mission must begin not with the defense of dogma, but with the lived experience of the oppressed. Gutierrez was not writing in the abstract. He had spent years walking alongside the poor in Lima's barriadas, sprawling neighborhoods of makeshift homes, many without running water or electricity. For him, poverty was not simply a lack of material goods. It was a system of exclusion, dehumanization, and silence. And if the gospel was good news at all, it had to be good news for those who suffered the most. The book argued that true liberation could not be separated into spiritual and material categories. The salvation of the soul and the liberation of the body were intertwined. If the church was to be faithful to Christ, it could not remain neutral in the face of exploitation and injustice. It had to take a stand. This was not a new message, but it was a new moment. Across Latin America, entire populations were struggling under military dictatorships, entrenched in poverty, and foreign-backed regimes. Gutierrez gave language to a growing current within the church that saw no contradiction between prayer and protest, between Eucharist and organizing. Faith required action. And for many priests and lay people, that meant choosing to live among the poor, serve in their communities, and amplify their voices. Theology is reflection, he wrote, a critical attitude, but it comes after the second step. The first is commitment. That commitment led thousands of priests, nuns, and lay leaders to form base communities, teach literacy, advocate for land reform, and accompany the poor in their daily struggles. They did not see themselves as political actors. They saw themselves as living the gospel. But regimes did not see it that way. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, clergy who aligned themselves with the poor were increasingly treated as threats. In some countries, like Brazil and Nicaragua, the movement took root and reshaped the church's relationship to its people. In others, especially Argentina, it was violently extinguished. Liberation theology did not fade because it failed. It was suppressed because it was working. The Vatican, too, grew uneasy. Though the movement was grounded in Scripture and Catholic social teaching, some church officials viewed it as dangerously close to Marxist ideology. As the Cold War intensified, so did institutional resistance. In 1984, In 1986, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, issued formal critiques of liberation theology, warning against what it called the politicization of the faith. These critiques did not reject the idea of a preferential option for the poor, an idea Pope John Paul II himself affirmed, but they drew a line between the Church's spiritual mission and any theological framework that seemed to advocate for structural change. Gutiérrez, to his credit, never wavered. He continued to write, teach, and serve, even as the opposition mounted around him. Over time, perception shifted. Today, Gutiérrez's influence is widely recognized. In 2014, he was publicly embraced by Pope Francis, who called him a good theologian. The ideas that once sparked suspicion now shape official church positions on economic inequality, environmental responsibility, and migration. But that evolution came slowly, and only after many were silenced. In Argentina, the movement never had a real chance. The combination of Cold War fear, military brutality, and a conservative episcopate ensured that liberation theology would remain a threat to be neutralized. Priests who taught its principles were disappeared. Nuns who served in the slums were murdered. The silence of the church hierarchy, its refusal to speak out, was taken by many as complicity. And in some cases, it went further. Certain bishops openly aligned themselves with the regime, blessing soldiers while ignoring the cries of the tortured. Gutiérrez never attacked the church. He asked whether it was truly following Christ, whether it still believed that Jesus was found not in palaces, but in the prisons, not in triumph, but in the cross. A Theology of Liberation wasn't a revolution. Gutiérrez's book doesn't offer a political program. It asks for something deeper. What is theology for? Who is it written for? And how should faith respond when the world is on fire? In the decades since its publication, the book has shaped not only religious thought, but global conversations on ethics, development, and responsibility. It has influenced everything, from community health programs to climate theology. But at its heart, it remains what it always was, a call to begin from below. A call to believe that the poor are not objects of charity, but subjects of their own history. That faith is not about escape, but about presence. When people disappeared in Argentina during the Dirty War, many turned to the church for answers, for guidance, for comfort. But in far too many cases, they were met with silence. In the Catholic Church and Argentina's Dirty War, sociologist and Jesuit priest Gustavo Morello examines why. Why did one of the most powerful institutions in the country remain quiet in the face of mass abductions, torture, and murder? And how do people of faith now reconcile that silence with a tradition meant to be grounded in moral courage? This is not a sweeping chronicle of the dictatorship. It is a precise and deeply researched exploration of what happens when faith, politics, and fear collide. Morello's study is built on dozens of interviews, archival records, and theological analysis, but it is also marked by lived experience. He himself was abducted by police in the 1980s, an encounter that left him with an unshakable question. Where was the church? The Catholic Church in Argentina was not uniform. Among its ranks were priests who lived among the poor, communities shaped by liberation theology, and individuals willing to risk their lives for justice. But Morello's research makes it clear that the institutional church, the bishops, the hierarchy, the public voice of Catholicism, often prioritized its relationship with the military regime over its duty to defend the disappeared. Rather than confront the violence, church leaders pursued stability. To challenge the regime was to risk losing political influence, access, and perhaps even the church's privileged position in Argentine society. But in doing so, they abandoned something far more vital, their role as a moral authority. Even when officials knew people were being taken, the prevailing instinct was to stay quiet. Investigations were avoided, inquiries delayed, requests for help deflected. There were exceptions, individuals who resisted, who sheltered the hunted, who demanded accountability. But these voices were not reinforced from above. in many cases, they were discouraged or sidelined. Morello argues that the institution chose self-preservation over prophetic witness, and in doing so, it forfeited credibility, not only with victims' families, but with countless Argentines who could not understand how such atrocities could unfold while pulpits stayed quiet. The book recounts haunting cases of priests and nuns who did take a stand, and the price they paid. One of the most well-known is the abduction of fathers Orlando Llorio and Francisco Jalix, two Jesuit priests serving in a Buenos Aires slum in 1976. They lived among the poor, ministered to their needs, and were seen by the regime as sympathetic to leftist causes. That suspicion was enough. They were kidnapped, held for 5 months, and tortured before being released. The Jesuit provincial at that time, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who would later become Pope Francis, faced criticism for what he did or did not do to protect them. The truth of his role remains debated, but the case captures the fog of complicity surrounding the church's actions in that era. Others did not survive. Bishop Enrique Angeli died in what was officially called a car accident in 1976. Decades later, it emerged that he had been assassinated for speaking out in defense of human rights. His death was intended as a warning, not just to clergy, but to anyone in the church tempted to challenge the regime. These stories are powerful not because they are abnormalities, but because they reveal the broader reality. Priests and religious who stood with the oppressed were often left without institutional protection. Morello asks not only why the church was silent, but what that silence communicated to the faithful, to the families of the disappeared, and to the regime itself. For many Argentines, the quiet felt like betrayal. It wasn't merely that bishops failed to speak out. It was what their silence was interpreted as consent. The dictatorship could view it as moral cover, assurance that there would be no condemnation from the pulpit. This cultivated what Morello calls a theology of ambiguity. The church maintained the language of peace, tradition, and order, but that very neutrality became a form of acquiescence. By refusing to name the crimes, they allowed them to continue. And yes, there were private letters to government officials, discreet interventions to secure releases, quiet conversations behind closed doors. But in the public arena, the space where the regime drew legitimacy, the church's voices was largely absent. This absence was not accidental. It was calculated. After the dictatorship fell and the truth of the disappearances began to emerge, some church leaders acknowledged their failures. There were apologies, occasional statements of regrets. A few bishops admitted that the church had not done enough to defend the defenseless. But there was no sweeping reckoning, no formal inquiry within the church, no unified confession of wrongdoing. This unresolved history still weighs heavily for survivors, for the children of the disappeared, and for a country still navigating the space between faith and memory. Morello's account is not an indictment of every priest or bishop, nor does it romanticize those who resisted. It is a clear-eyed look at the choices an institution makes under pressure, how it defines prudence, how it justifies silence, and how those decisions echo for generations. And it forces the question, in the face of state violence, is silence ever neutral? Or is it, in its own way, an answer? When we look back at the years of Argentina's dirty war, it's easy to focus on the most visible acts of violence. The kidnappings, the torture centers, the haunting absence left by the disappeared. But history rarely moves in clean, sharp lines. Often, it shifts in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. In the meetings not held, the words not spoken, the letters never sent. The story we explore today reminds us that institutions, like people, are shaped as much by what they choose to ignore as by what they actively pursue. Liberation theology carried a radical premise that faith demanded solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. In other countries, it took root and blossomed into movements that reshaped communities. In Argentina, it withered early, suffocated, under pressure, and fear, its branches cut before they could bear fruit. And yet, in the cracks left behind, individuals kept acting. A priest risking his life to speak truth. A mother refusing to stop asking where her child has gone. Friends holding vigils in the shadow of soldiers. These were small acts compared to the machinery they faced, but in them was the stubborn insistence that some truths cannot be erased. Decades later, justice comes in partial, delayed measures. A trial here, a confession there. But perhaps the deeper reckoning is not in the courtrooms. It is in the way society chooses to remember, to teach the next generation not only what happened, but how easy it was for silence to masquerade as neutrality. In the end, faith, whether in God, in justice, or in one another, is tested not only by moments of great risk, but by the slow erosion of our willingness to stand beside those who suffer. What we do and what we fail to do both leave their mark. Thank you for spending time with me on Gateway Books by Crestance. Each episode is an invitation to linger with a story, to let it challenge the way we see the world, to allow it to move us in ways we don't expect, to carry its questions with us long after the final page. My hope is that these conversations give you not just books to read, but ideas to wrestle with and moments to revisit. If you visit crestance.com, you'll find more than just past episodes and curated reading lists. It's a space for readers to feel at home, filled with book-themed gear, thoughtful gifts, and home decor that celebrates the worlds we enter through the pages. It's where the act of reading spills beyond the book itself, into the spaces we live and share, keeping the spirit of a good story close at hand. The stories we've explored today carry the weight of history and the quiet persistence of memory. They remind us that what we choose to ignore shapes the world as surely as what we choose to defend. They ask us to think about the silences we accept, the truths we dare to name, and the courage it takes to stand beside those who suffer. May we leave here willing to remember, willing to see, and willing to take our place among those who refuse to look away.